A millionaire disguises himself as a waiter and enters his own restaurant. A week later, he is horrified. The air was heavy in the Carter restaurant's headquarters conference room. James Carter, only 30 years old, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. It had only been 2 months since the sudden death of his father, Thomas Carter, and the impact of that loss still echoed through every aspect of his life. He wasn't prepared to take over the luxury restaurant chain his father had meticulously built over decades, but he had no choice. What had once been a distant, respectful view of his father's empire had now become his responsibility. He, who had spent the last few years focused on developing his own career, away from the family business, now found himself forced to take the reins of a legacy that seemed far bigger than he could handle. The first few months in charge had been turbulent. The demands were relentless, with advisors and managers bombarding him with decisions to make, and the numbers. Oh, the numbers. James was never a numbers guy, and now they seemed to be all that mattered. Each week, the financial reports showed a sharper decline in profits, something his advisors insisted was a reflection of the economic crisis and changing consumer behavior. But James knew there was more to it. He spent the night reviewing reports and analyzing data, but the answers he was looking for weren't there. Something wasn't adding up. The customer complaints, though sporadic, were becoming increasingly frequent. Comments about the quality of service, once impeccable, were now mingling with insinuations that the Carter restaurant's standards were slipping. James couldn't accept that. He knew what his father would think if he were alive. Excellence was non-negotiable. But how could a man who had spent most of his adult life trying to escape his father's shadow now save the legacy he had left behind? Doubt gnawed at James, but he knew something had to be done, and quickly. His father always told him that the key to success was understanding the business inside and out. Thomas Carter, although the owner, wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, literally. He was known for spending entire days in the kitchens of his restaurants, helping the chefs, listening to the waitstaff, and above all, meticulously observing every detail of the service. That's what James needed to do. If he wanted to save Carter restaurants, he would have to truly understand what was happening. But how? He was the boss now, and his presence commanded respect, and sometimes fear, among the employees. He knew that in his position, he would never hear the whole truth. No, he would need a different approach. That's when the idea came to him. Simple but risky. James decided that he would infiltrate one of his own restaurants. Not as the owner, but as a simple employee. If he wanted answers, he would have to get them on his own. Away from the watchful eyes and flattery that his position attracted, he would disguise himself as a waiter, adopt a new identity, and work alongside those who, apparently, had lost the motivation to maintain the standard his father had set. The decision wasn't easy. James knew that this would put everything at risk: his reputation, his control over the company, and even his safety. But he also knew there was no other way to discover the truth. With renewed determination, he began to plan every detail of his new identity. Michael Reed, he decided. A common name, without flair, someone who would go unnoticed among the other employees. So, while the corporate world around him continued to spin, James began his secret journey. Deep down, he knew that this decision could be the turning point. The moment when he would prove to himself and everyone else that he was capable of carrying the Carter legacy, or the moment when everything would fall apart for good. With one last glance at the documents on the table, he closed the folder and stood up. There was work to be done, and it would start at the ground level, just as his father always said. The next day, James Carter would temporarily cease to exist. In his place, Michael Reed would be ready to uncover the hidden secrets threatening to destroy his family's empire. Michael Reed was an ordinary man. At 30 years old, he had nothing extraordinary to tell about his life. He was a dedicated worker, someone who always did his best at work, but without big aspirations. At least that was the narrative James Carter had created for his new identity. By assuming this role, he knew he would need to completely distance himself from the man he had always been, the young heir to an empire, accustomed to a certain level of respect and authority. Now, he would be just another employee at the Star. The transformation process was meticulous. James spent hours studying the behavior of the waitstaff who worked in his restaurants, observing how they interacted with customers, colleagues, and even themselves. He needed to adopt the right posture, the appropriate tone of voice, and most importantly, the submissive attitude that often came with the job. No detail could be left to chance, as any slip could compromise his disguise. He cut his hair in a simple style, exchanged his expensive clothes for a basic waiter's uniform, and rehearsed his new life story. Michael Reed was a man who had worked in various restaurants over the past 10 years, always in search of a better opportunity. When applying for the job at the Star, he made it clear that he was willing to do whatever it took to impress. His record was clean, with no flashy references, just enough to secure a position at the restaurant without raising suspicion. On the day James introduced himself as Michael for his first shift, he felt a flutter in his stomach that he hadn't experienced since childhood. It was a mix of excitement and fear. He was about to enter a world completely different from the one he was used to. The difference, however, was that this world he had created himself, even without ever seeing it up close. As he entered the restaurant, he was greeted by a supervisor named Greg, a middle-aged man with a stern appearance who seemed to carry the weight of years of hard work on his shoulders. Greg wasn't the type to smile easily, and his critical gaze examined Michael from head to toe, as if trying to detect any sign of weakness. "So you're the new waiter?" Greg asked, with no trace of enthusiasm in his voice. "Yes, sir. Michael Reed," James replied, with a slight nod of his head, as if he was already adopting the subservient posture he knew was expected of someone in his new position. Greg just nodded, seemingly satisfied with the straightforward response. "Here at the Star, we don't have room for mistakes. You follow the rules, do your job, and we won't have any problems with each other. Clear?" James nodded, feeling the weight of Greg's words. Life inside wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to see things through the eyes of an ordinary employee. It was the only way to truly understand what was happening. James was introduced to the other team members, all of whom were busy with their respective tasks. The kitchen was buzzing with activity, chefs shouting orders and cooks darting from one side to the other, each with a specific role. In the dining area, waiters and waitresses moved quickly between tables, trying to meet the constant demand from customers who expected impeccable service. Michael was placed under the supervision of Emma Wilson, an experienced waitress who, despite the rush, always had a warm smile to offer. She was young, probably in her 20s, with bright eyes and a quick, agile way of moving through the dining room. From the first moment, James noticed that Emma was the kind of person who did her best to keep morale high, even when the work environment seemed determined to stifle any spark of joy. "So, Michael, ready for your baptism by fire?" Emma joked as she tied her apron. "Things can get pretty intense here, but if you keep up the pace, you'll do just fine." James smiled, grateful for the warm welcome. "I'm ready. Thanks for helping me get settled in." She nodded and began showing him the basic routines, from how to set a table to the right way to handle tricky orders. As the day went on, James noticed that the atmosphere at the Star was very different from what he had imagined while sitting in his office. He had always believed that his restaurants ran like well-oiled machines, where every employee knew their place and performed their tasks with precision. But what he saw was a tense environment, where smiles seemed forced, and the pressure to deliver flawless service at every moment was almost tangible. Mistakes, though rare, were treated harshly. He saw a waiter reprimanded for serving a table 2 minutes late, and a cook criticized for not preparing a dish exactly as the customer had requested. Every slip-up was noted, every failure magnified. Although completely immersed in his new identity, James couldn't help but feel the tension in the air. He knew he was about to uncover something much bigger than just operational errors. There was something deeply wrong in that place. And as Michael Reed, he was determined to find out what it was, even if it meant risking more than ever. Now familiar with the daily tasks, Michael Reed began to integrate into the Star team. Although he was focused on observing the environment, he found himself bonding with some colleagues, especially Emma Wilson. The young waitress was a ray of light in a place that, for James, was increasingly revealing itself to be dark. Emma was the kind of person who radiated positive energy, even when things seemed to be falling apart around her. She always had a kind word for others and never hesitated to help, even when her own responsibilities were piling up. For James, it was clear that Emma had a genuine love for her work, despite all the hardships. During one of their breaks, as they rested in the small employee break room, James saw an opportunity to learn more about the internal dynamics of the restaurant. "Emma, how long have you worked here?" he asked, trying to sound casual but eager to hear her answer. She smiled, grabbing a bottle of water. "It's been almost 3 years now. I started right after high school. This place, it's intense, but I like to think I make a difference for the customers, you know?" James nodded but noticed a shadow of fatigue in her eyes, something she tried to hide with a smile. "You really seem to like what you do," he commented. "But it can't be easy, right? I mean, dealing with all the pressure and everything." Emma sighed, hesitating for a moment before replying. "I do like it, yeah. But sometimes it's tough, Michael, especially when you work so hard and it feels like no one notices." James leaned in, interested. "What do you mean? The customers don't notice your effort?" She shook her head, looking down. "It's not so much the customers, it's more the management. We're constantly under pressure here. If something goes wrong, even if it's something tiny, we're the ones who get blamed. The pressure to meet the targets is huge, and we often feel like machines, not people." James felt a pang in his heart. This was exactly what he feared: a disconnect between management and staff, which reflected in the customer experience. "And how do you deal with that?" he asked, trying to understand how Emma managed to stay positive. She shrugged with a sad smile. "I guess I try to focus on the little things that still make me happy. The coworkers, the small chats with customers. But some days it's hard. Sometimes you just want to hear a thank you or a good job, but that rarely happens." James felt Emma's reality overlapping with the idealized vision he had of his own business. What she was describing wasn't just a management issue, but a cultural one, something he had never really grasped from his office. The lack of recognition, the pressure to meet unrealistic targets, these things were eroding employee morale and, consequently, the quality of service. That night, after the restaurant closed, James stayed behind to help with the cleanup, something Michael Reed would naturally do, but that James Carter had never done in his life. He and Emma worked side by side, and the conversation they had during the cleanup only confirmed his suspicions. Emma told stories of coworkers who had quit because they couldn't handle the pressure anymore, of moments when she thought of quitting too, but was convinced to stay by other team members who were also struggling to keep the work environment at least somewhat bearable. James couldn't help but admire Emma's strength. Despite everything, she remained firm, determined to do her best. But he also saw that this determination was wearing thin, and he feared that if nothing changed, Emma would eventually leave the restaurant, just like many others before her. And if people like Emma were on the verge of quitting, what did that mean for the future of the star? In the days that followed, James continued to work closely with Emma, observing how she handled customers and how, despite all the challenges, she managed to maintain a level of service that was far beyond what the management deserved. It was during this period that he began to grasp the depth of the problem. It wasn't just about goals and deadlines. It was about a fundamental lack of respect for the employees, something that trickled down from the top. The relationship between Emma and Richard Moore, the general manager, was particularly telling. Richard, whom James had only seen from a distance until then, treated Emma and the other employees with a near-tangible disdain. He never missed an opportunity to criticize them, always reinforcing the idea that they were expendable. To Richard, employees were nothing more than cogs in a machine, easily replaced if they broke. James knew he would have to act, but he wasn't sure how just yet. He needed to keep watching, to understand every angle of the problem before making a move. But one thing was certain. The problem was much deeper than he had imagined. every conversation he had with Emma, every interaction he witnessed, only strengthened his conviction that something needed to change. And fast. The question now was how he could do this without blowing his cover, and more importantly, without losing the trust of those who were starting to see him not just as Michael Reed, but as someone they could rely on. The time James spent undercover as Michael Reed at the Star only served to confirm his suspicions. The root of the problems at the restaurant was, indeed, poor management. And at the center of this storm was Richard Moore. Each day that James spent there brought him closer to the true nature of the man who, in theory, should have been leading the restaurant to success. Richard Moore was an imposing figure, with broad shoulders and a stance that exuded authority. His gray hair was always perfectly groomed, and his stern face rarely showed any sign of kindness. Richard's voice was firm, and he didn't hesitate to use it to impose his will. He was the kind of manager who ruled with an iron fist, believing that intimidation was the key to maintaining discipline and efficiency. To Richard, the restaurant was a machine, and he was the only one who knew how to operate it correctly. James, as Michael, soon realized that Richard had a narrow view of what it meant to manage a team. To him, employees were numbers, gears that could be replaced at any moment if they didn't perform to his expectations. The first direct confrontation that James witnessed between Richard and a team member was shocking. It was a busy afternoon, and one of the cooks, a young man named Lucas, made a small mistake in preparing a dish. The customer had requested a change in the sauce, but in his haste, Lucas served the dish with the original sauce. It was a small error, easily corrected, but Richard's reaction was disproportionate. Richard stormed into the kitchen like a tornado. His face was red with anger, and his voice cut through the air like a blade. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he shouted, as all the other cooks froze in place. Lucas, terrified, tried to apologize, but Richard didn't give him the chance. He continued to berate the young man, exposing him in front of everyone, with no regard for the boy's dignity. James watched, feeling the indignation grow inside him. He knew that Lucas's mistake didn't warrant public humiliation. This wasn't leadership, it was an abuse of power. But at that moment, he could do nothing but watch and mentally take note of everything. His mission there was to fully understand what was going on, and situations like this were crucial for him to formulate an action plan. Richard continued to fire off his orders and criticisms, making sure to emphasize that any deviation from the standard would be severely punished. He made it clear that the success of the Star depended on perfection, and he would tolerate nothing less. The atmosphere in the kitchen, already stressful, became suffocating. The cooks worked in fear of making the slightest mistake, while the servers avoided Richard as much as possible. Emma, who had witnessed the scene alongside James, was visibly uncomfortable. Later, while the two were setting up the dining room for the next shift, she quietly remarked, "I can't stand seeing that. No one deserves to be treated like that, especially not over such a small mistake." James nodded in agreement, feeling the same outrage. "It's like he doesn't realize we're human," Emma continued. "To him, we're just tools to achieve the numbers he wants." That statement stuck with James. He knew Richard was obsessed with results, but he hadn't realized the extent to which this obsession was affecting the employees' daily lives. To Richard, hitting targets was the only thing that mattered, and he didn't care about the means. It was clear that the cost-cutting policy Richard so heavily promoted was eroding the team's morale, and consequently, the quality of service. Over the weeks, James saw Richard repeat the same pattern numerous times. When the numbers didn't meet expectations, he would double down on the pressure on the team. With every failure, no matter how small, he responded with harsh criticism and veiled threats. James knew that Richard was destroying what his father had so carefully built. An environment where excellence was the result of passion and dedication, not fear and oppression. James also noticed that Richard was becoming increasingly suspicious of Michael Reed. The new waiter, who seemed so diligent and observant, was beginning to raise eyebrows. Richard watched him closely, his eyes often lingering on him during team meetings. It was as if he sensed something was off, but couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. This growing suspicion began to worry James. He knew that sooner or later Richard would try to find out more about Michael, and any slip-up could be catastrophic. He would need to be even more cautious if he wanted to continue his investigation without being discovered. However, with each passing day, the urgency to act grew. James knew he couldn't wait much longer to confront Richard and save what was left of the star. But he also knew that a hasty move could destroy everything he was fighting for. It was a dangerous game, and time was running out. But one thing was certain. James Carter was determined not to let Richard Moore destroy his family's legacy. And as Michael Reed, he would continue to watch, to plan, and when the right moment came, he would be ready to act. The weeks flew by, and James, still undercover as Michael Reed, felt the pressure of maintaining his hidden identity while trying to understand and eventually solve the star's problems. The restaurant, once the pinnacle of the Carter Network's excellence, was now on the brink of collapse, stifled by Richard Moore's oppressive management. With each passing shift, James could see more clearly the devastating impact Richard was having, not just on the quality of service, but also on employee morale. James knew something needed to be done, and while he couldn't reveal himself just yet, he could start planting seeds of change. Small gestures that might go unnoticed by Richard, but could mean the beginning of a new era for the staff. His first step was to focus on communication. He had noticed that the lack of open dialogue among the team was one of the restaurant's biggest issues. Management imposed rules and goals without any explanation or consultation with the staff, creating an environment of resentment and mistrust. James decided to encourage more open and collaborative conversations among his coworkers. He started subtly. During breaks, while others rested or ate in silence, he initiated conversations asking how they felt about their daily tasks, what they thought could be improved, and if they had any ideas to enhance the service. He did this casually, without making it seem like he was leading or searching for something specific. Gradually, his colleagues began to open up more. "Sometimes I feel like no one really listens to what we have to say," confessed Lucas, the young cook who had been humiliated by Richard. "I feel like we're just here to follow orders, not to really contribute anything." James agreed and encouraged the others to speak up too. Emma, who had always been a positive voice in the group, now felt comfortable sharing her frustrations, and other team members began doing the same. Over time, these conversations started to build a sense of camaraderie that hadn't existed before. James realized that by giving the employees space to express their opinions, he was slowly breaking down the barriers imposed by Richard's management. The atmosphere, still tense, began to show signs of change. James also noticed that many of the problems at the Star stemmed from the excessive pressure on employees to meet often unattainable standards. Richard was obsessed with efficiency and profit, but completely ignored the impact his demands had on service quality. James decided he would start challenging this mentality, albeit in a discreet manner. During an especially hectic shift, when the restaurant was packed and the staff was overwhelmed, James saw an opportunity to act. He noticed that the cooks were struggling to keep up with orders, and the waitstaff was on edge, knowing any mistake would be harshly punished. When he saw that a dish was about to go out with a small flaw, he did something unexpected. "Let's take a second to check this together," he suggested to one of the chefs, keeping his tone calm. "I'm sure if we make a quick adjustment, we can avoid Richard coming down on us for something that's really not worth it." The chef, who would usually have ignored a suggestion from a waiter, looked at him in surprise but agreed. The dish was corrected and went out perfectly, without anyone noticing the original issue. These small acts of collaboration started to spread among the staff. Employees who had once feared failure now began to support each other more, helping to avoid mistakes and improve service. James knew Richard wouldn't notice these changes right away, but he also knew that each small gesture was planting the seeds for something bigger. At the same time, James was aware that Richard was growing more suspicious. The manager had begun discreetly questioning other employees about Michael Reed, trying to learn more about the new waiter who seemed so interested in helping. James knew he would have to be even more careful, but he was also determined to keep up his efforts. One of the most critical moments came when Richard announced an unexpected performance review. He informed the team that due to recent inefficiencies, everyone would be individually evaluated, and those who didn't meet expectations would be let go. James knew this was an intimidation tactic, meant to reinforce Richard's control over the team. During the evaluations, James, as Michael, was called into Richard's office. The atmosphere was oppressive, and the tension was palpable. Richard, sitting behind his desk, cast a cold glance at James before speaking. "So, Michael, how do you think you're doing so far?" James stayed calm, knowing any hesitation could raise suspicions. "I think I'm adapting well, sir. I'm learning the restaurant's dynamics and doing my best to contribute to the team." Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Contributing, huh? I've heard you've been quite active, suggesting changes and encouraging conversations among the staff. Is that true?" James knew he was treading on dangerous ground. "I believe a team that communicates well works better, sir. And the more I understand how the restaurant functions, the more I can help prevent problems." Richard didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be considering something, his eyes fixed on James as if trying to solve a puzzle. "You're here to work, Michael, not to lead. Remember that. Now, get back to your station and do your job." James left the office, feeling Richard's gaze on his back. He knew he was being watched, but he also knew he couldn't stop now. The changes he was starting to implement were small but crucial, and as long as he kept his true identity hidden, he would still have time to make a difference. James, disguised as Michael Reed, knew he was playing a dangerous game. With each passing day, he got closer to the truth about what was ruining the Star. But it also became more evident to Richard Moore that there was something unusual about the new waiter. The tension was palpable, and James felt the constant weight of Richard's watchful eye, who seemed determined to learn more about Michael Reed. The changes James had begun to implement were having a positive, though subtle, impact. The employees, once fearful and demotivated, began working with a bit more confidence, knowing there was someone among them who supported them. However, this improvement did not go unnoticed by Richard, who started to notice that the team was more united than ever. To Richard, this newfound unity was suspicious. One day, during one of the morning team meetings, Richard gave an unexpected speech. "I've noticed that some of you are getting a bit too comfortable," he began, with a tone that suggested this wasn't necessarily a good thing. "That's admirable, but let me remind you that we're here to work, not to socialize. Our priority is efficiency, and any distraction or behavior that deviates from that goal will be dealt with accordingly." James kept his head down, but he felt Richard's eyes on him for a brief moment. He knew Richard's words were a veiled warning, a way to suppress any attempt at change that hadn't been authorized by him. The meeting ended in tense silence, and the employees returned to work, with the atmosphere of fear beginning to settle in again. Later that same day, James was approached by Greg, the supervisor. Greg was a reserved man who did his best to remain neutral in matters involving management and employees. However, this time, he seemed concerned. "Michael, can I have a word with you?" Greg asked, in a tone that indicated this wasn't just a casual conversation. James followed Greg to a more secluded corner of the restaurant, where they could talk without being overheard. "Listen," Greg began, looking around to make sure no one was paying attention. "Richard's keeping an eye on you. He thinks you're influencing the others. That's not good." James felt a chill run down his spine but kept a neutral expression. "I'm not trying to cause any trouble, Greg. I'm just trying to do my job and help where I can." Greg sighed, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "I know, and I think a lot of people here appreciate what you're doing. But Richard doesn't like change, especially change he doesn't control. I'm just saying you should be careful. He's already started asking about you." This news confirmed James's worst fears. Richard was investigating Michael Reed, and any wrong detail could reveal his true identity. James knew he needed to be more cautious, but he also knew he couldn't back down now. He was close to uncovering the full extent of the problems at the Star, and quitting at this point wasn't an option. That night, as they were closing the restaurant, James took the opportunity to speak with Emma privately. They were in the stockroom organizing supplies, and the privacy of the location allowed for an honest conversation. "Emma, do you think things are getting better here?" he asked, trying to gauge her perception of the recent changes. Emma paused for a moment, reflecting before she answered. "I think so. I mean, it feels like we're working better together, like a real team, you know? But I still feel like we're walking on thin ice. Richard, he's always watching us, and I know he doesn't like how things are changing." James nodded, aware of the risk they were taking. "I've noticed that too. But I think if we keep supporting each other, we can make a real difference here." Emma smiled, but it was a tired smile. "I hope so, Michael. But sometimes, it feels like we're fighting an enemy that's much bigger than us." Those words stayed with James as he left the restaurant that night. He knew the battle was just beginning, and that Richard wouldn't give up easily. But he also knew he had to keep going. The employees of the Star deserved a better work environment, and the customers deserved the quality service that the Carter brand always promised. In the days that followed, Richard intensified his investigations into Michael. He began asking subtle questions to other employees, trying to learn more about the new waiter. James knew he needed to be prepared for anything. He reinforced his disguise, mentally reviewing all the details of his new identity, ensuring that he wouldn't let anything slip that could raise further suspicion. One day, while organizing orders in the kitchen, James noticed Richard watching him closely. Richard approached and, with an almost casual tone, asked, "Michael, where did you say you were from again?" The question seemed innocent, but James knew it was a trap. "I'm from a small town in the countryside, sir. I don't think you've heard of it. I worked at a few local restaurants before moving here," James replied, his voice calm and confident. Richard nodded, but James knew the manager wasn't convinced. "You seem quite competent for someone who's only worked in small places," Richard commented, leaving the insinuation hanging in the air before walking away. This interaction made James even more alert. He knew Richard wouldn't stop until he discovered who he really was. The pressure was mounting, and James needed to find a way to act before it was too late. He had to save the Star, but to do that, he would have to be smarter and faster than Richard. The atmosphere at the Star was more tense than ever. Every employee felt the weight of Richard Moore's watchful eyes, and James knew that the moment of truth was approaching. Richard's distrust had grown to an unsustainable point, and James felt that at any moment, he would be forced to reveal himself. He had spent weeks infiltrating, observing, trying to change things subtly, but now it seemed like everything was about to explode. The confrontation James feared finally came on a busy night when the restaurant was packed. The dining room was full of demanding customers, and the staff was working to the limit. James, as Michael was doing his job trying to keep calm while helping his colleagues, he knew Richard was somewhere, watching every move, waiting for the slightest slip-up. It was then that Lucas, the young cook whom James had defended weeks earlier, made another small mistake. He mixed up an order and sent out a dish with the wrong sauce. It was a minor error, something that could easily be corrected, but James saw the furious look on Richard's face as soon as the dish left the kitchen. Richard marched into the kitchen, fists clenched, and began yelling at Lucas, this time in an even more cruel and humiliating manner. "I've warned you about these mistakes, you incompetent fool," Richard shouted, shoving Lucas against the counter. "Do you think this is a joke? Do you think I'm going to tolerate this lack of professionalism?" James, who was serving a nearby table, heard the shouting and immediately dropped what he was doing. He knew that at that moment, he could no longer just stand by. Richard was going too far, and James could no longer allow his employees to be treated that way. He walked into the kitchen and saw Richard about to raise his hand against Lucas. Without a second thought, James stepped between them. "Enough, Richard," he exclaimed in a tone that silenced the entire kitchen. Everyone stopped what they were doing and stared at James, surprised by his intervention. Richard, still red-faced with anger, looked at James with a mix of fury and disbelief. "Who do you think you are to give me orders here, Michael?" he asked sarcastically. "You're just a waiter, remember that." James took a deep breath, feeling that this was the moment. There was no turning back now. "Richard, I'm more than just a waiter," he replied firmly. "My name isn't Michael Reed. I'm James Carter, the owner of this restaurant and the entire Carter chain." The revelation dropped like a bomb in the kitchen. The silence that followed was absolute. All eyes were fixed on James, some with surprise, others with fear of what would come next. Richard turned pale for a moment, but then his expression shifted to a mix of anger and desperation. "Is this a trick?" Richard asked in a low, almost whispered tone. "You can't be James Carter. What are you doing here, disguised as one of us?" James remained calm, but his voice was firm. "I was trying to understand what was going wrong in my restaurant, and now I know. You, Richard, are destroying everything my father built. Your tyrannical management, your disrespect for the employees, all of it is ruining the Carter family legacy, and that's going to stop now." Richard took a step back, but still tried to defend himself. "I did what was necessary to maintain efficiency and profits," he said, but his voice was trembling. "I kept this place running." James stepped forward, facing Richard. "You kept this place running at the cost of my employees' dignity and well-being. That's not leadership, Richard. It's abuse of power, and I won't tolerate it any longer." Richard looked around, realizing everyone was listening, waiting to see what would happen next. He knew he had lost control of the situation. "You're going to fire me, is that it?" he asked, trying to maintain some shred of dignity. James paused before answering, ensuring his words carried the necessary weight. "Yes, Richard, you're fired, and I'll make sure you never have the opportunity to treat another team this way again." Richard was silent for a moment before walking out of the kitchen without looking back. The staff, still in shock, watched as he left. When the door closed behind Richard, a collective sigh of relief swept through the room. James turned to the staff, especially Lucas, who was still visibly shaken. "I'm very sorry you had to go through this," James said sincerely. "I should have stepped in sooner, but things will change from now on." He looked around the kitchen, seeing the faces of his employees, people he had only known as the distant boss until that moment. "I'm going to work alongside you to make sure this is a place where everyone can be proud to work, where respect, dignity, and quality are more important than any number on a report." Emma, who had entered the kitchen in the middle of the confrontation, smiled at James, her eyes shining with gratitude. She was the first to speak. "Thank you, Mr. Carter. I think I speak for everyone when I say we're relieved to know things are going to change." James nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also the relief of finally revealing his identity. He knew the work was just beginning, but now, with Richard out of the way, he had the opportunity to rebuild what had been lost. The news of Richard Moore's dismissal spread through the Star like wildfire. The manager everyone feared, the man who ruled with an iron fist, had been removed in a matter of minutes. For the staff, it was as if a storm had finally passed, leaving behind a strange sense of relief mixed with uncertainty about the future. The one they believed had absolute power had been brought down by someone they thought was just another waiter. James Carter, now without the disguise of Michael Reed, felt the gravity of the moment. The revelation of his true identity and Richard's subsequent dismissal were necessary actions, but he knew these were just the beginning. The real work, rebuilding trust and restoring the quality his father had established, was still to be done. The day after Richard's dismissal, James called a meeting with the entire team. Everyone was there, from the cooks to the waitstaff, gathered in the main dining area where they would normally serve customers. The atmosphere was charged with tension, but also with new hope. James stood before them, fully aware that the words he was about to say would be crucial for the restaurant's future. "First of all, I want to thank you all for being here today," James began, his voice firm but full of sincerity. "I know the past few months haven't been easy. You've been working under immense pressure, and I know many of you felt there wasn't enough support or respect to continue. That is unacceptable." He looked into the faces watching him intently. Some were still visibly shaken by the events of the previous day, while others seemed eager to see what would happen next. "I should have been more present, should have understood what was happening here before it got to this point. But now that I know what needs to be done, I'm determined to change things." James paused, giving time for his words to sink in. What happened yesterday with Richard wasn't an isolated incident. It was the result of management that lost sight of what really matters: people. And that's not going to happen here anymore. Not while I'm in charge. A murmur of approval passed through the room, but James knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. He needed concrete actions to prove he was committed to change. "From now on, I want this restaurant to be a place where everyone feels valued, where every voice is heard. We're going to start working together to rebuild the Star. That means if you have suggestions, concerns, or ideas, I want you to know my doors are always open. And of course, this applies to all other Carter chain restaurants." Emma, standing in the front, was watching closely. James could see hope rekindling in her eyes. She had been a cornerstone of his undercover investigation, and he knew he could count on her to help lead this new phase. "I'm going to start implementing immediate changes," James continued. "We're going to review management practices, ensure that everyone here has the tools and support needed to do their job the best they can. I also want to ensure that the work environment is respectful and positive. This is non-negotiable." He then looked directly at Emma, making sure to include her in the conversation. "Emma, you've been a source of support and motivation here, even when things were tough. I want you to know that I deeply value that, and I'd like your help in leading this new beginning." Emma was visibly moved but maintained her composure. "Mr. Carter, it would be an honor. Like everyone else here, I just want to see the Star return to what it once was." James nodded, satisfied with her response. "That's exactly what we'll do. And we won't stop until we're sure this place is the best it can be for everyone, employees and customers." The meeting ended with a renewed sense of purpose. The employees, who had previously been demotivated and apprehensive, now seemed more willing to take on the challenge of transforming the Star. James knew he had gained their trust at that moment, but he also knew that he would need to continue working hard to maintain that trust. In the days that followed, James began implementing the changes he had promised. He made sure to actively participate in the restaurant's operations, working alongside the staff, listening to their concerns and suggestions. James's presence on the restaurant floor was a clear sign that things were changing. One of the first major changes was the revision of performance goals. James knew that Richard's obsessive focus on efficiency and immediate profits had damaged team morale. He began working with the managers to create goals that, while challenging, were realistic and achievable, ensuring that employees had the support needed to reach them. He also started promoting a culture of recognition. Small gestures like publicly praising an employee for a job well done or implementing a reward system for the team began to make a difference. James knew that respect and appreciation were fundamental to creating a healthy and productive work environment. Richard's dismissal also had a positive impact on the team. With him out of the way, employees began to feel more comfortable expressing their opinions and collaborating more openly. The constant fear of reprisal was replaced by an atmosphere of mutual support and cooperation. Emma, who had become an informal leader among the employees, played a crucial role in this process. With the confidence James had placed in her, she helped guide the team through the changes, ensuring that everyone felt included and heard. Her positivity and dedication became contagious, and soon the atmosphere at the Star began to visibly improve. James knew the work was far from over, but the first steps had been taken. Richard's downfall marked the beginning of a new era for the restaurant, an era where service quality and employee well-being were paramount. Over time, James saw the results of his actions begin to flourish. Customers, who had previously complained about the decline in quality, began to notice the improvements. Positive comments started to appear, praising the service and the renewed atmosphere of the restaurant. The employees, now more motivated and valued, began working with renewed energy, and the Star started to regain the shine it had lost. James knew there was still much to do, but he was confident he was on the right track. He had brought down Richard, but more importantly, he had planted the seeds for lasting change. And with a united and committed team, he knew the Star had a bright future ahead. The days following Richard Moore's dismissal were marked by a sense of renewal at the Star. The restaurant, which had previously seemed to be sinking under the weight of poor management, began to show clear signs of recovery. The team, now free from the constant fear of reprisal, began adapting to the new reality with enthusiasm and renewed energy. James Carter knew that to ensure the changes were lasting, he would need to do more than just replace a tyrannical manager. It was necessary to implement a new management philosophy that not only improved team morale, but also elevated the quality of service to even higher levels than before. The first major change James made was introducing the concept of participative management. He firmly believed that those on the front lines, the waiters, cooks, and supervisors, had the best ideas for improving the restaurant's daily operations. He began holding weekly meetings with the entire team, where anyone could voice their opinions, suggest improvements, and openly discuss the challenges they faced. These meetings quickly became the highlight of the week for many employees. For the first time, they felt their voices were being heard and their contributions valued. Emma, who quickly assumed a leadership role within the team, was one of the most active participants in these meetings. She frequently brought forward ideas on how to improve the customer experience and optimize workflow in the kitchen. James always made it a point to acknowledge her suggestions, which only boosted everyone's confidence and morale. One of the first initiatives that emerged from these meetings was the restructuring of new employee training. James realized that the previous training was overly rigid and did not adequately prepare new team members for the real challenges of day-to-day work. Under Emma's guidance, the training was revamped to be more practical and collaborative, with new employees receiving mentorship from more experienced staff and being encouraged to ask questions and try new approaches. Another important change was the menu review. James knew that to maintain the culinary excellence his father had established, the menu needed to be dynamic and reflect customer expectations. He organized a series of workshops where chefs and waiters worked together to develop new dishes, test new flavor combinations, and adapt the menu to better meet customer demands. These workshops not only resulted in a revitalized menu, but also strengthened the camaraderie among the team. Cooks and waiters who previously barely spoke outside of work hours now actively collaborated, exchanging ideas and learning from each other. This collaboration was reflected in the service, which became more efficient and harmonious. As these changes began to take hold, customers started to notice the differences. Positive comments began to appear, both on social media and in face-to-face conversations. James made a point of monitoring this feedback and sharing it with the team during meetings, ensuring that everyone knew the positive impact of their work. However, James knew he couldn't afford to rest on his laurels. He was determined to expand the improvements at the Star to the entire Carter chain. To do this, he began visiting the other restaurants in the network, applying the lessons learned at the Star, and adapting the changes to the particularities of each location. But while working on the transformation of the Star and the other restaurants, James also found himself growing closer to his team. He realized that to truly lead effectively, he needed to be present, not just as the owner, but as someone who understood the daily struggles and triumphs of his employees. James started spending more time on the floor, interacting directly with customers and staff. He helped serve tables, actively participated in the kitchen, and even assisted with cleaning up at the end of the night. His constant presence and willingness to work side by side with the team made the employees feel even more valued and motivated. Emma, in particular, became an indispensable ally in this transformation process. Her ability to connect with colleagues and her passion for the work were contagious. James trusted her to help implement the changes and to keep team morale high, especially during challenging times. The relationship between James and Emma deepened, based on mutual respect and a shared vision of transforming the Star into a model of excellence. Emma not only became a vocal presence in meetings, but also began to be seen as a natural leader by the team. Her colleagues looked to her for guidance and support, and she was always ready to help. The transformation at the Star didn't happen overnight, but over time, James watched the restaurant become a place of pride for everyone involved. The atmosphere was lighter, customers were more satisfied, and employees felt part of something bigger than just a job. They were a team, united by a common purpose. With trust restored and service quality renewed, the Star began attracting new customers, and even former patrons who had distanced themselves due to past issues started returning. The restaurant's reputation, which had been tarnished by Richard's poor management, began to be restored, and James knew this was just the beginning. He still had a lot of work ahead, but now, with a motivated and committed team by his side, he was more confident than ever that the Carter chain was on its way to a new era of success. And it all started with the transformation at the Star, which had become the model of how a restaurant could thrive when people were put first. With the changes implemented and the atmosphere at the Star revitalized, James began to notice a palpable transformation, not just among the staff, but also in how the restaurant was perceived by the public. The quality of service, which had been the cornerstone of the Carter restaurant's reputation, was finally returning to what it had always been, and in many ways, it was even surpassing expectations. Customers started to feel the difference as soon as they walked through the doors of the Star. The environment, once tense and heavy, was now warm and inviting. The smiles on the staff's faces, which had once seemed forced and tired, were genuine. Every detail, from the way the tables were set to the presentation of the dishes, reflected the new energy that James and his team had infused into the restaurant. James paid close attention to customer feedback. He knew that to fully recover the reputation that had been damaged, it would take more than just good intentions. He needed tangible results, and that meant listening carefully to those who mattered, the customers. Each night he made it a point to talk to the diners, asking about their experiences, taking notes on suggestions, and ensuring that any issues were resolved quickly. On one of those nights, as he moved from table to table, James was approached by an older couple, longtime customers who hadn't visited the restaurant in years. "It's been ages since we last came here," the man said with a nostalgic smile, "but we decided to give it another try, and we're impressed. It feels like the Star has become that special place it always used to be for us." James felt a wave of satisfaction hearing those words. "I'm so glad to hear that," he responded sincerely. "We've been working hard to make sure all our customers feel welcome and have a memorable experience." These kinds of interactions became more frequent as time went on. Positive comments began to pop up on social media, and word spread that the Star was back to its former glory. Food critics, who had been harsh in their previous reviews, returned to the restaurant and praised the improvements. Some of the city's most influential publications even highlighted the Star as a successful example of revitalization in the dining scene. However, James knew he couldn't afford to be complacent. Restoring the reputation was just the first step. Maintaining it would be an ongoing challenge. He continued to lead his team with the same determination, encouraging innovation and excellence in all aspects of the business. One of the strategies James adopted to keep up the momentum was the creation of an internal feedback program, where employees could suggest improvements anonymously if they wished. He wanted to ensure that everyone's voices were heard, not just in meetings, but whenever they felt the need to express something. This program not only helped identify areas that needed adjustment, but also reinforced the culture of transparency and collaboration that James was determined to cultivate. Emma, who was now taking on an increasingly central role in the management of the restaurant, was instrumental in implementing this program. She was the one who most encouraged her colleagues to participate and trust that their opinions would be taken seriously. "What we're building here isn't just a restaurant, it's a community," she would say whenever a new employee joined. And in a community, every voice matters. James watched with pride as Emma's positive impact on the team became more evident. She not only helped keep morale high, but also inspired others to push themselves harder and always strive for the best. He knew that much of the Star's recent success was due to her natural leadership and the way she embodied the values he wanted for the Carter network. The results were becoming apparent not just in feedback, but financially as well. The customer flow increased, and with it, revenues began to consistently recover. James monitored the numbers closely, but unlike Richard, he didn't let profits be the sole indicator of success. To him, true success was seeing his employees happy and fulfilled, knowing they were contributing to something bigger. One night, while reviewing the numbers with Emma after closing, James couldn't help but express his gratitude. "Emma, "I couldn't have done this without you," he said, looking her in the eye. "You've been essential to this transformation, and I know that with you by my side, we can take this even further." Emma smiled, humble as always. "Thank you, Mr. Carter, but I just did what anyone in my position would do. The credit belongs to all of us working together." James shook his head, gently disagreeing. "Maybe, but don't underestimate the impact you've had. What we're building here is special, and you're a crucial part of it." That moment further solidified the partnership between James and Emma. They knew the work was just beginning, but both were committed to continuing what they had started. The star had begun to shine again, and with the team they had, there were no limits to what they could achieve. With the star firmly back on its path to recovery, James Carter turned his attention to the future of the Carter chain as a whole. The transformation at the restaurant wasn't just an isolated success, but a model he intended to replicate across every unit in the network. And with that, he envisioned a new era for the Carter restaurants, one marked by excellence, innovation, and respect for everyone who was part of the journey. James knew he couldn't do it alone. The experience at the Star had shown him the importance of shared leadership, where every team member played a vital role. And among all of them, Emma Wilson had stood out as a natural leader, someone who not only inspired others, but also deeply understood the value of collaboration and empathy. It was on a sunny morning during one of the weekly meetings with the Star team that James announced the next phase of his vision for the Carter network. "I want you all to know that the incredible work you've been doing here hasn't gone unnoticed," he began, smiling proudly. "You've managed to turn this restaurant into something we can all be proud of, and I want to bring that same energy to all the other restaurants in the network." The team's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. It was clear that pride in what they had accomplished so far was deeply rooted, and the idea of taking this experience to other units filled them with motivation. "For that," James continued, "we need strong leaders, people who understand our philosophy and can help guide these changes. And that's why today I'm very pleased to announce that Emma Wilson will be promoted to General Manager of the Star. And more than that, she will be my partner in leading the renewal initiatives across the entire Carter network." There was an explosion of applause and smiles, and Emma, visibly emotional, needed a moment to process the news. She had poured her heart and soul into the restaurant, but never expected such a significant promotion. "Mr. Carter, I don't know what to say," she began, still trying to find the right words. It's an incredible honor. I just want to do my best." James stepped forward and shook Emma's hand firmly. "You deserve it, Emma. Everything we've achieved here is largely thanks to you, and I know that together we can bring this transformation to all our restaurants." With this new position, Emma began working alongside James to implement changes in the other restaurants in the network. She traveled to different cities, meeting the teams, understanding the unique challenges of each unit, and bringing with her the lessons learned at the Star. The reception was extremely positive, with many employees expressing relief and gratitude for finally having leadership that cared about their opinions and was willing to work alongside them, rather than just dictating orders from above. The impact of these changes began to reflect in the numbers, but more importantly, it showed in the people. Employees who had previously been demotivated and tired began to work with more enthusiasm, knowing that their contributions were valued and that they were part of something bigger. Loyal customers noticed the difference in service and quality, and new customers began to appear, drawn by the renewed reputation of the Carter restaurants. One afternoon, as James and Emma met to review the progress, he paused to reflect on all they had achieved up to that point. "It's amazing to see how much things have changed in such a short time," he commented, looking over the feedback spreadsheets from customers and employees. "But what impresses me most is how much we've all grown together." Emma smiled, feeling the same. "It's true. I never imagined we'd be here doing this a few months ago. But I think it shows how much we can achieve when we really care about people." James nodded, feeling satisfied with the direction they had taken. "It makes me think of my father," he said, more to himself than to Emma. He always believed that success came from people. But I think somehow I lost sight of that. Thankfully, I found my way back, and you've been an essential part of that. Emma was silent for a moment before responding. Mr. Carter, your father would be proud of everything you've done here. You haven't just kept his legacy alive, you've taken it even further. James felt a lump in his throat, touched by Emma's words. Thank you, Emma. That means a lot to me. Over time, the changes that started at the Star spread throughout the Carter network, transforming it into a success story, not just because of the quality of its dishes, but because of how it valued each of its employees. The Carter restaurants returned to being what they were always meant to be, places where excellence wasn't just a goal, but an everyday reality, built by a dedicated and passionate team. In the end, James knew that while there were challenges ahead, he was ready to face them. He had learned that true success wasn't just measured in numbers, but in the positive impact he could have on the lives of those around him. And with Emma by his side, he was ready to lead the Carter network into a new era of prosperity and respect, honoring his father's legacy in a way he had never imagined before.